Today, humanity stands alone, the only human species on a planet that once teemed with many. But that wasn't always true. 300,000 years ago, the Earth was home to at least 8 other kinds of people, living their lives in parallel to ours. Some stood barely waist high, while others carried brains larger than our own, a world of extremes in human form. Sea levels sat 120 meters lower than today, exposing coastlines that stretched far wider, connecting islands to continents. In Europe, stocky Neanderthals crouched around fires deep inside limestone caves, built to endure the crushing cold of the Ice Age. Far to the south in Africa, Homo naledi, small-statured and graceful, moved through dark, narrow cave systems with a skill we can only imagine. On the island of Java, the oldest of them all, Homo erectus, still walked the riverbanks, having mastered fire and stone long before our own lineage began. On a tiny Indonesian island, evolution sculpted something unique. Homo floresensis, the so-called hobbits, small, efficient, and resilient, hunting pygmy elephants in a world that seems like fantasy. Somewhere in the high mountains of Tibet, the mysterious Denisovans were adapting to the thin air, leaving behind genetic echoes that still live on in people today. And deeper still, in the genetic code of modern populations, we find whispers of other ghost lineages, species we have yet to name, but who walked the same earth under the same stars. Humanity was not a ladder. It was a tangled, branching bush, with each species a separate shoot, some growing strong, others fated to wither. Homo sapiens began as a newcomer in Africa, untested, unremarkable, just another twig on that bush, no guarantee of survival. So the haunting question becomes, how did a planet teeming with human diversity become the domain of just one branch? If you're enjoying this quiet journey into the past, consider subscribing. This story gets stranger before it gets clearer. Before we meet them individually, we have to ask, what does it actually mean to be human? Not philosophically, biologically. For a long time, the answer seemed simple. Brain size. A large cranial capacity defined membership in the genus Homo. But the Earth had surprises. The small-brained toolmakers of Flores and the ritualistic behaviors of Homo naledi shattered that simple rule. Walking upright wasn't unique either. Our ancestors had done that for millions of years, before the genus Homo even appeared. Tool use wasn't unique either. Birds and primates use tools. A crow can fashion a hook from wire. That's not what made us human. Being human, it turns out, is a constellation of traits: anatomy, behavior, adaptability, not just one metric. Evolution does not preserve the strongest or the smartest. Often, it preserves the luckiest, those in the right place when the climate shifted. Meet the wanderer who set the stage for everything that followed. Homo erectus, the first human to leave Africa. Long before your species existed, long before Neanderthals emerged, this pioneer walked out of the ancestral homeland nearly 2 million years ago. Erectus spread across 2 continents, adapting to climates ranging from tropical forests to temperate woodlands, from river valleys to coastal plains. Homo erectus endured for nearly 1.9 million years, a span so vast it dwarfs the entire existence of Homo sapiens by a factor of 9. They were taller than their predecessors, with longer legs and shorter arms, a body plan that finally severed the last ties to a life spent in trees. By 1.8 million years ago, Erectus had arrived in what is now the Republic of Georgia, at a site called Dmanisi. The Dmanisi fossils reveal a population that was smaller and more variable than later Erectus groups. The species was still evolving as it spread. Some populations moved east into China, where they would become known as Peking man. Others pushed south, island hopping across land bridges into Indonesia. It was on the island of Java that Erectus made its final stand, surviving until approximately 117,000 years ago, long after the species had vanished from mainland Asia. In the 1930s, along the Solo River on Java, excavators pulled 12 skulls and 2 leg bones from the sediment at a site called Ngandong. For decades, their age was a guessing game. Estimates ranged from 550,000 years old to as recent as 27,000 years, but rigorous dating published in 2019 settled the question. The Ngandong fossils are between 117,000 and 108,000 years old. Those dates mean Homo erectus and Homo sapiens did exist at the same time, but in different regions. Our species didn't reach Java until around 73,000 years ago, at least 35,000 years after the last Erectus had vanished. They likely never met. Around 120,000 years ago, the climate shifted. The open woodlands and savannas where Erectus had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years began giving way to dense tropical rainforest. Erectus, with its conservative tool technology and reliance on open country hunting, could not make the transition. Erectus brains averaged around 900 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than earlier hominins, but smaller than later humans like Heidelbergensis or Sapiens. Their signature tool, the Acheulean hand axe, remained largely unchanged for over 1 million years. They controlled fire too. The earliest solid evidence comes from a site in Israel dated to around 790,000 years ago. Fire gave them cooked food, warmth in colder climates, and protection from predators, expanding the range of environments they could inhabit. By the time Erectus went extinct on Java, the world had changed dramatically. They left behind only bones and tools scattered across 2 continents, silent testimony to a life lived long and widely. The great wanderer's journey had finally ended. If Homo erectus was the great wanderer, then Homo heidelbergensis was the great ancestor, the last common thread connecting 3 of the most successful human lineages that would dominate the planet for the next 500,000 years. This species emerged around 700,000 years ago, likely evolving from late populations of Homo erectus in Africa. By 500,000 years ago, heidelbergensis had spread across much of the Old World, reaching Europe, Western Asia, and possibly parts of Eastern Asia. The first fossil assigned to this species was discovered in 1907 near the German town of Mauer. Workers digging in a sandpit unearthed a massive jawbone, heavily built, completely lacking a chin, yet with surprisingly small, modern-looking teeth. The jaw was enormous, heavily built, and completely lacked a chin, yet the teeth were surprisingly small and modern-looking, a combination of traits that suggested something intermediate between ancient Homo erectus and the more recent Neanderthals. Over the following decades, more fossils emerged: a skull from Broken Hill in Zambia, another from Petrolona in Greece, one from Arago in France, and a remarkable collection of bones from Sema de los Huesos in Spain. Each added pieces to the puzzle. What united them was a brain size that hovered around 1,200 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than Erectus, but not quite reaching the upper limits seen in Neanderthals and modern humans. Heidelbergensis mastered a sophisticated method of stone tool production called the Levallois technique. It required forward planning and an understanding of how stone fractures, visualizing the final product before the work even began. At Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears dated to around 400,000 years ago were discovered. Not simple sharpened sticks, but carefully crafted weapons balanced for throwing, with the center of gravity positioned to maximize accuracy and distance. At the same site, horse bones bearing cut marks from stone tools tell the story. Heidelbergensis was hunting large game, and doing so with remarkable success, working cooperatively in groups. Fire was part of their toolkit too. Hearths in Israel dating back nearly 800,000 years show that Heidelbergensis controlled fire with a competence suggesting it had been part of their culture for tens of thousands of years. Stone tools, sourced from quarries dozens of kilometers away, point to long-distance trade networks, and a level of communication that went beyond simple gestures and grunts, perhaps a form of proto-language. Around 400,000 years ago, regional differences that had always existed within Heidelbergensis populations began to deepen, driven by geography, climate, and the simple fact that groups separated by thousands of kilometers rarely interbred. In Europe, the Heidelbergensis populations began evolving traits that would eventually define the Neanderthals: shorter, stockier bodies adapted to cold, larger nasal cavities for warming frigid air, and a subtle reshaping of the skull. In Africa, the Heidelbergensis populations kept their longer limbs and leaner builds, a body plan suited for shedding heat in tropical and subtropical climates rather than conserving it. By 300,000 years ago, the first skulls that could truly be called anatomically modern had appeared in Morocco and Ethiopia. Higher foreheads, rounder brain cases, faces less robust than the Heidelbergensis they evolved from. In Asia, another branch was quietly diverging, a group that would become the Denisovans, a lineage so elusive that for decades, no one even knew they existed. By 200,000 years ago, Heidelbergensis as a distinct species had effectively vanished, not through extinction, but through transformation, splitting into 3 separate human lineages. One ancestor had just become 3: Neanderthals in Europe, Homo sapiens in Africa, and Denisovans in Asia, each branch carrying a portion of the old Heidelbergensis genome into its own future. Heidelbergensis was not a dead end. It was a crossroads, the last time a single human species spanned continents and held the potential to become something new. This snapshot in time, 300,000 years ago, captured the genus Homo at its peak diversity, more distinct forms than at any other point in its 2 million-year history. Geography had sorted them, not open warfare, but separation and specialization, with each lineage occupying its own niche, its own climate zone, its own corner of the habitable world. In Europe, the Neanderthals were taking shape, their bodies growing shorter-limbed and barrel-chested, their noses widening to warm icy air before it reached the lungs. Their brains, still evolving, would soon rival any humans, and in some ways exceed it, averaging larger than the brains of the first Homo sapiens. In Africa, early Homo sapiens was emerging from its heidelbergensis ancestry, but the transition was not yet complete. These earliest members of your species were anatomically modern in some respects, higher foreheads, rounder skulls, more gracile faces, yet they still retained enough archaic features that if you encountered one on the street today, you might hesitate before calling them fully human. Far to the east, in the mountains and valleys of Central Asia, the Denisovans were thriving in isolation. Their lineage had split from the Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago, and almost nothing is known about their physical appearance. The fossil record has yielded only fragments, a finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of jaw, found on the Tibetan plateau. On the Indonesian island of Java, Homo erectus was entering the final phase of its existence. Still hunting along the Solo River, as it had for more than 1,000,000 years, it was unaware that the climate was shifting beneath its feet. On Flores, island dwarfism had already shrunk humans dramatically. Over hundreds of thousands of years, a population stood barely a meter tall, with brains no larger than a chimpanzee's, yet they made sophisticated stone tools and hunted pygmy elephants. On Luzon, another island population was evolving in parallel, though the fossil evidence is far more limited: a few teeth, a handful of finger and toe bones. Enough to establish that Homo luzonensis existed, but not enough to say much about how it lived or what it looked like. In southern Africa, deep within a cave system that would not be explored by modern humans until 2013, Homo naledi was doing something that still baffles scientists, carrying bodies into dark, narrow passages, perhaps as a form of burial or ritual. And then there were the ghost populations, the ones we know about only through genetics, shadows in the genome of modern humans that hint at species we have not yet found or may never find. This, then, was the world 300,000 years ago. At least 9 species, possibly more, all recognizably human in the broad sense, but different enough that had they met, they would have known immediately that the other was something distinct. None of them knew that the experiment was about to end, that within another 260,000 years, only one species would remain. The bush, so thick and tangled and full of branches, was about to be pruned down to a single stem. In 1856, workers quarrying limestone in Germany's Neander Valley uncovered a skeleton unlike any they had seen: heavy brow ridges, a thick skull, and bones that seemed wrong for any modern human. Naturalists examined those bones and concluded they belonged to something ancient and primitive, perhaps a different species entirely, one that had lived and died long before modern humans ever walked the earth. But over the next century and a half, more fossils emerged, and the picture shifted. Neanderthals were not distant cousins, separated by millions of years. They were our siblings, diverging from a common ancestor just 400,000 years ago. Their bodies were stocky and powerfully built, shorter limbs, broader torsos, a design that minimized surface area and conserved heat through the brutal ice ages that dominated Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. And their brains were enormous, averaging 1,500 cubic centimeters, 100 more than the modern human average. This alone should have dispelled any notion of Neanderthals as dim-witted brutes, but stereotypes die hard. But those brains were wired differently. The occipital lobe, which processes vision, was proportionally larger, while the frontal lobe, tied to abstract reasoning, was smaller. Their minds worked in ways not quite like ours. Neanderthals made tools in the Mousterian tradition, but not all the same. In southwestern France, they created lighter blade tools. In Italy, they worked obsidian into edges sharper than steel. Regional variation hinted at distinct local cultures. Fire was central to Neanderthal life, not just for warmth, but as a technology. They built hearths with care, arranging stones to contain flames and position them for maximum heat and smoke ventilation, cooking food and hardening wooden spears. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavations in the 1950s uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton buried deliberately, his body placed in a shallow grave, and possibly accompanied by flowers, based on pollen grains found in the soil. And in Spain, cave paintings dated to over 64,000 years old, well before Homo sapiens reached Europe, have been attributed to Neanderthals. Geometric shapes and hand stencils, marking a desire to create symbols that carried meaning. In Croatia, Neanderthals fashioned jewelry from eagle talons, stringing them together into necklaces or bracelets. And in France, they carved deliberate patterns into bone and antler, not strictly functional, not purely random, but something in between, a mark of a mind that saw shape and wanted to leave it behind. The question of language lingers. Neanderthals carried a version of the FOXP2 gene, nearly identical to the one in modern humans, a gene linked to the fine motor control required for speech. The anatomy for speech was present. Whether they used it in the same way you do is impossible to determine, but the biological capacity was real. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of mass kills, entire herds of horses or bison driven over cliffs, or into dead-end valleys. This wasn't simple scavenging, it was coordinated, large-scale cooperative hunting, requiring planning, communication, and a shared strategy that anthropologists once believed was unique to Homo sapiens. Despite their adaptations, Neanderthal populations began declining sharply around 50,000 years ago, just as Homo sapiens was expanding out of Africa and into Europe. The two species would overlap for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer, and during that time, something happened that would change the story forever. Genetic studies have confirmed that all non-African humans today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of encounters that happened somewhere in the Middle East or southern Europe tens of thousands of years ago. The interbreeding was not extensive, but it was enough to leave a permanent mark on the modern human genome. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had dwindled to a few isolated refuges in southern Spain and the Balkans. By 39,000 years ago, even these last holdouts had disappeared. The very last Neanderthals, living in caves in Gibraltar, were gone, and the continent they had dominated for 300,000 years was empty of them. They did not vanish because they were inferior, they vanished because the world changed. The climate shifted, their prey moved, their habitats fragmented, and they could not change fast enough. It was not a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of timing, a species perfectly adapted to one world, caught off guard by the next. But they were not erased either. The Neanderthals were absorbed, integrated into the expanding populations of Homo sapiens, their DNA diluted, but never entirely lost. In that sense, they are still here, a permanent part of what it means to be human, a reminder that you are not purely one thing, but a composite of lineages that once walked the earth as separate species. The Denisovans are the most enigmatic of all the human species that lived 300,000 years ago, not because they left behind no evidence, quite the opposite, but because what they left behind is so fragmentary and scattered that piecing together who they were remains one of the great challenges of paleoanthropology. The first Denisovan fossil was discovered in 2008 by Russian archaeologists excavating Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a remote region near the border of Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and China. Among the bones from the deepest layers was a tiny finger bone, no larger than a thumbnail, belonging to a juvenile female. Then, in 2008, a tiny finger bone was unearthed in Denisova Cave, Siberia. Its DNA matched no known human species. This was a new lineage, one that had split from the Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago. They were named Denisovans. In 2019, a jawbone found on the Tibetan plateau pushed their known range to extreme altitude. It proved Denisovans lived at 3,000 meters, at least 160,000 years ago, long before modern humans conquered the heights. One Denisovan gene, EPAS1, helps modern Tibetans process oxygen efficiently at high altitudes, a gift from a vanished species. Melanesians carry the highest share of any living population, 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, a direct inheritance from ancient encounters. Some Denisovan genes may even explain the Bajau people's extraordinary free-diving ability, a legacy written in their DNA. Denisovans themselves carried DNA from an unidentified archaic ghost species, a lineage that left no fossils, only genetic echoes. No complete Denisovan skeleton has ever been found. They remain phantoms, known almost entirely through their genes. Islands famously shrink large mammals through a process called dwarfism, and humans were no exception. In 2003, a team of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists digging in a limestone cave on Flores called Liang Bua uncovered a nearly complete skeleton that would rewrite the map of human diversity. The skeleton was an adult female, but she stood barely 1 meter tall, roughly the height of a modern 3-year-old child. Her brain, measured from the volume of her cranial cavity, was only 400 cubic centimeters, smaller than any known adult human, closer in size to a chimpanzee's. At first, many scientists dismissed it as a single deformed individual, but then the team unearthed bones from at least 12 more individuals, all similarly tiny, all adults. The species was named Homo floresensis after the island. The press immediately nicknamed them hobbits, and the name stuck. Flores during their time was a world apart, home to pygmy elephants called stegodon, giant rats the size of cats, and enormous lizards. Despite their tiny brains, the stone tools found alongside them were sophisticated, blades, scrapers, and points that required planning and skill to make. On Flores today, local stories speak of the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy, human-like creatures who lived in caves and stole food, until villagers drove them out centuries ago. In 2007, researchers excavating Calao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines found a single foot bone that appeared to belong to a tiny hominin, but they couldn't be sure. Then, in 2019, more bones emerged from the same cave: teeth, finger bones, toe bones, and they revealed an entirely new species, Homo luzonensis. Their curved finger and toe bones tell the story. These were not just walkers, but climbers, equally at home in the canopy, where the island's fruits and birds lived. Here's the riddle: Luzon has never been connected to any mainland by a land bridge. Not during any ice age, not when sea levels dropped over 100 meters. Reaching Luzon meant crossing at least 50 kilometers of open ocean, either by accident, on a raft of storm-tossed vegetation, or by design, a voyage that would rewrite what we thought early humans could do. The entire fossil record of Homo luzonensis is just 13 bones, all from a single cave. And here's the strange part: no stone tools have ever been found with them. Small brains, real tools, fire, survival. These species shatter the old assumption that a bigger head always means a smarter mind. Crows solve multi-step puzzles with a brain the size of a walnut. Octopuses escape sealed containers with a nervous system spread through their arms. Brain size is not the whole story. Brains are energy hogs, burning a fifth of your daily calories. On an island where food is scarce, a smaller, efficient brain isn't a disadvantage, it's a survival strategy. In September 2013, two recreational cavers, exploring South Africa's Rising Star cave system, squeezed into a passage no one had ever entered before. They descended a vertical chute called Dragon's Back, barely 18 centimeters wide at its tightest point, and dropped into a chamber no modern human had ever seen. Scattered across the chamber floor were bones, over 1,500 of them, belonging to at least 15 individuals of a species no one had ever seen, Homo naledi. Their hands were a puzzle, curved fingers for climbing, yet a thumb and wrist built for precision grip. Their feet were equally modern, arched and proportioned for efficient long-distance walking, just like ours. But their brain was startlingly small, only 500 cubic centimeters, about the size of a chimpanzee's. In 2017, shocking dates placed them squarely in the Middle Pleistocene, just 335,000 to 236,000 years ago. The bodies appear to have been deliberately carried into that deep, inaccessible chamber, a place no predator or flood could reach. If confirmed, this small-brained species practiced ritual burial and controlled fire, abilities once thought exclusive to large-brained humans. The question lingers: how did such small-brained species endure for hundreds of thousands of years in a world of larger-brained rivals? Isolation protected Flores. Hidden caves may have sheltered naledi similarly, a niche no one else wanted. Intelligence may depend more on brain wiring than raw volume, how neurons connect, not just how many there are. For decades, textbooks claimed Homo sapiens simply replaced every rival outright, a clean, simple story. But the DNA told a different tale. Then, in 2010, a team of geneticists sequenced the entire Neanderthal genome from 3 bone fragments found in a Croatian cave. The results overturned the clean, tidy story of replacement overnight. When they compared that ancient DNA to living people, they found something startling. Every human with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, a ghost from ancient encounters in the Middle East. But the surprises didn't stop there. When scientists sequenced the Denisovan genome from that Siberian fingerbone, they found that Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA, a separate, even deeper encounter. In 2018, researchers in that same Siberian cave made another stunning discovery. A single bone fragment belonged to a teenage girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan, proof that these species met and mingled directly. Even within Africa, the pattern holds. Modern African genomes contain segments of DNA that don't match any known fossil species, ghost populations that interbred with early Homo sapiens but left no bones behind, only genetic echoes. The message was clear: species boundaries in human evolution were never closed doors, they were permeable membranes, and interbreeding was not an exception, it was the rule. Yet by 40,000 years ago, the tide had turned. The world that had teemed with human diversity for nearly 2 million years was emptying out, species vanishing one by one. Neanderthal populations retreated into isolated refuges, the caves of Gibraltar, the mountains of the Balkans, the Caucasus. Small, fragmented bands, separated by terrain and dwindling numbers. Climate shifts disrupted the herds they depended on. Competition with expanding Homo sapiens strained already scarce resources. And disease, though invisible in the bones, may have delivered the final blow. But no evidence of massacres has ever been found. No mass graves, no weapons embedded in Neanderthal bones. The replacement was not a war, it was slow demographic erosion, a quiet fading over thousands of years. Small, isolated groups were not outcompeted so much as genetically absorbed into the far larger sapiens population. So why did Homo sapiens alone survive when other species seemed stronger, or smarter, or more cold adapted? It wasn't bigger brains, Neanderthals had those. It wasn't raw strength, they were stronger. And it wasn't cold adaptation. What sapiens had was flexible language, far wider social networks, and a knack for rapid technological innovation. Larger, more interconnected populations meant greater genetic diversity and far more resilience against shocks like climate shifts or disease. Sapiens survived through adaptability and luck, not predestined superiority. Evolution doesn't crown winners, it just keeps the ones that fit. The cost of our survival was steep, a dramatic, permanent loss of human diversity that once spanned the globe. Neanderthal genes still boost modern immune systems. Variants in the HLA complex, inherited from them, give enhanced resistance to certain viruses. Other Neanderthal DNA shapes modern hair color, skin tone, and even freckles, traits that helped in low-light northern environments. We are not one pure lineage, we are a mosaic, a living archive of every lost species. Their genes still echo inside us.